Good morning, everyone. My name is Cheryl Gittens, and I'm the Assistant Vice Provost in the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Educational Achievement. And I'm also the incoming Deputy Vice Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I get the opportunity to welcome you today, and I'm really pleasantly surprised at the ongoing support and the outpouring support for this very important conversation. Today, our division is hosting a conversation that is imperative and must be held with your presence. You're invited to chat with us today. We will collectively address the issue of racism. Every single person participating is important and has a role to play in creating a campus community and society that is fair and equitable and just for all. Although not always clear, it is not always simple, it's not always obvious. I trust that you will leave this session today with an increased sense of awareness, a deeper knowledge, and more importantly, and most of all, a commitment to actions that lead to positive change. Today we have over 2,000 participants joining us, and I want to thank all of the people, especially the staff at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who helped to put this together. But collectively with campus partners, we are committed to this discussion today. So I want to thank the UW-Madison Do It User Services, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, the Mortgage Center for Public Service, the Discovery to Product, the Collaborative Center for Health Equity, the College of Letters and Sciences, the Wisconsin Foundation and Alumni Association, as well as the U.S. Bank. Today I want to introduce you to Nina Johnson of U.S. Bank, who is our corporate sponsor and will also give you greetings. Okay, I think we're having some technical difficulties with Nina's microphone. So I want to invite our co-host to the platform, and we can forward our slide to begin our dialogue.
Dr. Gittens, if that means me, thank you. I'm pleased to be here again. Everyone, my name is Grady Crosby. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs and the Chief Diversity Officer for Johnson Controls. And I am just peacock proud to be with you all today and to have this opportunity to lead this discussion that we're going to have over the next couple of hours. I do want to again thank Dr. Gittens for her leadership and the visionary leadership of the entire UW-Madison faculty and staff who had the foresight to put this together at a very timely moment in our history, as well as Nina. Even though we couldn't hear Nina, I'm very familiar with Nina Johnson, great community supporter, and we appreciate her and U.S. Bank so much for all that they're doing to support this effort and their sponsorship of this event. For some reason, the setting the stage has been laid in my lap. I don't know how you set this stage, because this stage that we're talking about today is enormous. And I think we're going to find that even the time that we have today is going to seem short when we look at all of the things that we want to address. And for that reason, we can't examine it all. So if you are one that, kind of strives for completion, I'm going to tell you, there's going to be a space in here where you're going to have to settle with some ambiguity in some spaces, because we just can't hit it all, because there are so many facets to talk about here as we talk about our commitment to change and a call to action. I read on someone's Instagram page that 2020 almost like that old Nintendo game we used to play when you had to take the cartridge out and blow on it to get it playing right, because 2020 just ain't playing right. 2020 has been a heck of a year, and you know that maybe the start was this whole health pandemic that we've experienced throughout our world. That health pandemic just seemed to unmask and present more vividly some disparities and some inequalities that are going on in our community, perhaps things that we always knew. But because of the global pandemic, it was just put in our face in more vivid terms than before, because that health pandemic seemed to disproportionately impact people of color in communities all around the world, and Wisconsin is no exception to that. And so we saw that, and then combined with the health pandemic, we saw the economic impact that readily ensued on top of the health crisis. And because of that, people are getting laid off and furloughed, and places are shutting down. And it just so happened that a lot of the places that were shutting down and a lot of the jobs that were being lost were jobs in the service industry, or jobs where people don't have the luxury of being able to work from home or work remotely. And it just so happens that these were a lot of the jobs that were held by Black and brown people. So the economic crisis began to set in on our community as well. Then, but again, that was nothing that hadn't been going on before. Again, the health crisis just put a new spotlight on it. Then we had the unfortunate murder, George Floyd in Minneapolis. Again, not a situation that hasn't occurred before, but now that everyone has video camera in the back pocket, we're able to be exposed to more of the things that are going on in our communities. And not only George Floyd, but we know what happened with Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and again the Eric Garner, and you go back, and the list just goes on and on about the racial injustice, the biases that are impacting our people wherever they live in this country, and I dare say around the world. But it seemed like what happened with George Floyd was one of those situations that galvanized people to take to the streets, that galvanized people to call for some type of change. And that's kind of what we want to discuss here. What is the commitment to change that the nation seems to be screaming for? And what are the particular call to actions that individuals can do to help address this racial and social inequality that we're facing? And again, it is so complex. This pandemic and even these issues that we're discussing today is something that has impacted everyone. Now, it may not impact you like it impacts me, but it's definitely something that impacts everyone. And you hear people now, even with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement, and even as high as the highest office in our country talks about the fact that maybe Black Lives Matter is an insensitive statement, is equivalent or tantamount to even some type of hatred in speech. But I don't know about you and who else is on this call, but when I hear Black Lives Matter, I don't put a face to that statement. I don't put an organization behind that statement. I see that statement as a fundamental fact that Black lives matter. It's not an exclusionary statement that only Black lives matter. And it's not an exclusionary statement that all lives don't matter. It's just that right now, there are some issues that are going on with Black lives. And there are some things that need to be adjusted and talked about with regard to the systems that we operate in that impact Black lives, that should give us some pause and some cause for concern. And so I see it as a way for us to focus our attention on an issue that's impacting a segment, a vital segment of our community. And like I said, this issue has so many different levels of complexity. I said it may not impact you the way that it impacts me. For whatever reason, I'm one of those Black males that has never had a unfortunate encounter with law enforcement. But that's my story. That's not the reality for all of my brothers and sisters. I am one who has had some unfortunate encounters in the corporate boardroom, some biases that I've had to fight through with regard to career, with regard to living in the neighborhood, with regard to obtaining a loan, with regard to buy. So those are some of my issues with regard to health, some of the things that I can buy, some of the available items in my local grocery store that impact my health. These are some things that have impacted me. And so as we go through this, I want you to recognize that everything may not impact you the same way, but if we can get to some understanding, perhaps we can develop a mutual respect. Through that mutual respect, we can determine that we're going to take a stand. Even if it's a stand to understand, that will be a step in the right direction. You know, when you talk about these issues, and I lead our sustainability efforts at Johnson Controls as well, and you talk about a green earth and less waste and less energy emissions, everybody is on board and think it's a great idea. And that's kind of how I feel today. When we talk about these commitments to racial equality and righting social injustice, everybody is on board and you feel it's a great idea. The rubber hits the road when you ask people who are willing to change their behavior in order to make that a reality, because behaviors have to change. Fortunately, today, I don't have to answer all those questions because I have such dynamic people that are with us here today on this panel. They're going to bring some perspectives from a national level all the way down to the corner. We're going to make sure we try to hit it all. And the first person I want to give way and provide a platform to is a lady that I've had an opportunity to work with over the course of this summer, Dr. Pamela Newkirk. And I think you're going to enjoy hearing the perspective of Dr. Newkirk. And I'm going to ask her to open up her cam and unmute her mic. And I'm going to ask those who are not presenting to make sure we don't flood the system or lock anything down. If you would shut down your cameras so we could focus on Dr. Newkirk as she presents to us. And I'm going to pose a question to her. But first, for those who may not be familiar with Dr. Newkirk, you should be, because she's a dynamic lady, a dynamic journalist, a dynamic professional. Dr. Newkirk is a Type Media Center Fellow and a professor of journalism at New York University. She's a multifaceted scholar and journalist whose articles examining race and African-American portrayals have appeared in publications including the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, and The Guardian. Her current book out, Diversity, Inc., The Failed Promise of a Billion-Dollar Business, examines efforts to diversify American institutions over the past 50 years. And she reaches some interesting conclusions with regard to Diversity, Inc. And she's the author, again, of a number of books. The enormity of her work and the brevity of our time together doesn't allow me to go into it all. But I'm going to ask Dr. Newkirk, you know, a lot of people have been talking about this commitment to change that we're seeing now looks different than maybe what we saw in the 60s. It looks different for some reason. Why do you think there is this renewed commitment to change? And based on your work, Dr. Newkirk, what are your observations of our current climate right now? Dr. Newkirk.
Good morning. Good morning, Dr. Gittens, Nina Johnson, Grady Crosby, my fellow panelists, and all of you tuning in for this discussion. I'm delighted to join you today during what I think is a pivotal moment in our nation's history. While we have been propelled by tragedy and unrest to reflect on the centuries-long issue of racial injustice, the nation's conscience has been stirred in ways that offer the greatest potential for change in a generation. Many Americans finally appear ready to dispense with the delusion of a post-race America and face the reality of persisting injustice. I'm reminded of James Baldwin's adage, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So all around us, institutions are heeding protesters' demands for change. And I just want to make sure I'm being heard because I keep getting these alerts.
Yes, I hear you. You're doing fine.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was a little distracted by alerts. I said, am I being heard? Okay. So all around us, institutions are heeding protesters' demands for change. The Washington Redskins finally agreed to reconsider changing its offensive name. Police reforms have been passed across the country, and some named for Black victims of fatal police killings. Corporate CEOs are proclaiming that Black lives matter. Iconic Black images of servitude are being removed from products, and Confederate statues and symbols are finally being retired across the South. Just last week, Princeton University, after years of resisting, decided to remove Woodrow Wilson's name from its School of Public Policy. Wilson's racism, Princeton's president conceded, was, quote, significant and consequential, even by the standards of his own time. He added, quote, Princeton is part of an America that has too often disregarded, ignored, and turned a blind eye to racism, allowing the persistence of systems that discriminate against Black people, close quote. So this blatant disregard of Black people and other non-white people, this disregard rooted in a history of conquest, has been underscored in recent weeks by the myriad ways it's expressed in the culture. So the work must now begin to move beyond symbolic gestures to institute lasting systemic change that honors our national ideals. And each of us has a role to play during this national moment of reckoning. So Grady, you've asked me here to share some of my research exploring the 5 decades long effort to diversify the American workplace and why we've ultimately failed to realize racial diversity. My book, Diversity, Inc., The Failed Promise of a Billion-Dollar Business, is informed by my own experience working both in daily journalism and higher education, 2 realms in which African Americans are radically underrepresented. But the book is based on extensive research on efforts over the past 5 decades to diversify American institutions, focusing on higher education, Hollywood, and corporate America. But workplaces cannot be hermetically sealed off from the culture in which they exist. So my book explores more broadly many of the issues that have come to light in recent weeks, among them persistent racial disparities evident in every social indicator, and surely we saw it in the coronavirus pandemic, the criminalization of Black and brown men, which too often results in senseless tragedy, the kind of racial customs recently glimpsed in a videotaped encounter between a white Central Park dog walker and a Black bird watcher, and a cultural landscape rife with demeaning narratives and iconography. So diversity cannot flower in a polluted ecosystem. Even as institutions pledge anew their commitment to change, their efforts will not take root unless we also address a toxic culture that diminishes and demeans. We must also combat a prevailing racial illiteracy, an airbrushed history that serves to erase, romanticize, or distort reality, and the normalization of injustice in every sphere of American life needs to be addressed. If we are to reimagine a more just and inclusive nation, higher education must play a central role, for it is where pernicious theories of racial hierarchies were constructed, legitimized, and disseminated, and have never been sufficiently dismantled. Notions of racial inferiority and superiority resonate still. Our refusal as a nation to confront until now the truth of race and injustice and a deeply rooted ideology of white preeminence has left many ill-equipped to understand, let alone tackle, enduring inequities. And it's part of the reason why, despite decades of pledges, multi-billion-dollar diversity initiatives, and far more diverse candidate pools, we have failed to realize racially diverse and inclusive workplaces. The numbers are telling. Racial and ethnic minorities make up nearly 40% of the national population, but comprise just 17% of full-time university professors, which includes faculty at historically Black colleges and universities. Hispanics and Blacks, who together encompass roughly 31% of the US population, are just 3% and 4% respectively of full-time professors. Their numbers have barely budged in decades. The numbers in academia, like those in other influential fields, defy our rosy ideals. Between 2009 and 2018, the percentage of Black law partners has inched up from 1.7 to 1.8%. People of color comprise 8% of law firm partners. Between 1985 and 2016, the proportion of Black men in management in US companies with 100 or more employees barely increased from 3% to 3.2%, until under 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs are Black and 4% are of color. So this acute underrepresentation in every influential field defies the nation's rapidly changing racial demographics. In 2011, for the first time in America's history, more babies of color were born than non-Hispanic whites. Since 2010, non-Hispanic whites have been the minority in 22 of the nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas. And the US Census projects that by 2045, whites will no longer constitute a national majority. But after 5 decades of countless studies, public pledges, and high-profile initiatives, diversity is still lagging while the business of diversity is booming. Each year, institutions spend billions of dollars on diversity czars and consultants, climate surveys and studies, to little avail. So I wanted to interrogate the tension between the rhetoric and the billions of dollars institutions annually spend on diversity and the chronically disappointing results. And in the brief time we have today, I hope we can explore not only the factors that contribute to the current diversity landscape, but what institutions might do differently to usher in systemic change. And I hope our discussion can specifically focus on the issue of racial diversity, since it has in many ways been eclipsed by the ever-widening diversity lens. In 2018, Denise Young-Smith, Apple's then Vice President of Inclusion and Diversity, took the ever-evolving definition to the extreme when she suggested that 12 blue-eyed, blonde white men could also illustrate diversity due to their different backgrounds. Diversity is the human experience, she said. I get a little frustrated when diversity is tagged to people of color or the women or the LGBT. So as diversity for many institutions becomes untethered from the history and legacy of racial injustice, the plight of racial minorities in general and African Americans in particular has been eclipsed. And overlooked too are the ways in which racial minorities become doubly and triply burdened by interlocking systems of discrimination related to their other identities, including physical and cognitive disabilities, gender and sexual orientation. And while my book explores the issue of racial diversity and focuses on the three largest racial and ethnic minority groups, the stark disparities between Blacks and whites remains the most illuminating indicator of America's racial breach. With institutions poised to act, it is my hope that they will not resort to the same failed practices that have turned diversity into a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry that has failed to increase diversity. And one more thought before I turn over the microphone. The speed with which change has occurred in recent weeks compellingly shows that racial progress doesn't require more time or elaborate strategies. It mostly requires intention and will. Thank you.
That's such an excellent point, Dr. Newkirk, because we've seen the speed of this move at warp speed here lately, and I appreciate so much all your provocation in your remarks, and I hope our audience picked that up as well. They need to get this book, Diversity Inc., especially if you're trying to run a diversity department or diversity initiative, to as you so eloquently put it, to investigate the tension between the investment versus the results. But we have another great panelist who's going to give us a national perspective as well. Shawn Dove is with us, and he's queued up and he's ready to go. Just a little bit about Shawn. Shawn is the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, CBMA, which is a national membership organization committed to improving the life outcomes for Black men and boys. Under Shawn's leadership, CBMA has leveraged more than $212 million in national and local funds for Black male achievement, and has grown to include nearly 6,000 individual and 3,000 organizational members across the U.S. And I want to pose this question to Shawn as he steps up to the mic here. Taking, following up on Dr. Newkirk, can you talk to us about some of these actionable steps that need to be taken to impact change for more inclusion? And you've definitely been one that has seen some investment into these initiatives. How have you taken that investment and made impact by changing the trajectory of lives? And particularly since we are on the forum being sponsored by the University of Wisconsin-Madison, what's the role of institutions of higher learning? Dr. Newkirk touched on it, but what's your thoughts about the role of institutions like UW-Madison in this landscape we see today?
Great. Thanks, Grady. Great to be here. Thanks for the introduction. Dr. Newkirk, thanks for setting me up for going after you and putting all of that pressure on me. I just wanted to say I'm grateful and thankful for being here. I want to just really elevate first, Grady, when you asked what can be done. I think we all have to understand that we can be both brave and afraid in this moment of racial reckoning in the United States. We can remember that we have been here before. I have got to also lift up Sister Cheryl Gittens, Tracy Williams Macklin, and Nina Johnson. And while we did not hear her, I can tell you, based on her corporate sponsorship and her involvement in that sector, is she might have said, you know, no mission, no money, no mission. I would venture to say that we all have a part to play in this, right? This is not an isolated issue that we are dealing with that one sector can handle alone. So I will say this, Grady, that academia and institutions of higher learning are highly responsible for solving America's greatest dilemma of racism, right? Because within its roots, within its foundings, you know, often we are creating the conditions that we say we don't want, right? And I just want to let everybody know that's here. I'm excited by the turnout, that we were all born for such a time as this. I truly believe this moment of reckoning that we are in, what we have seen and what we saw in the death of George Floyd, to me, is emblematic of what we saw in the death of Emmett Till in 1955, and how his death ignited the civil rights movement, right? And I got to lift up the spirit of Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till. It was her spirit that she was brave and unafraid, and she said, I wanted to have an open casket so that the nation, that the world can see what racism, what hate, what bigotry did to my 14-year-old son. And I had to say, and I got to lift up the bravery of Darnella Frazier, who took the videotape, stood there as we saw the life seep out of George Floyd, and for the nation and for the world to see that. And I want to say also that thank God for the pandemic, because George Floyd certainly was not the only one. Grady, you lifted up other names, but there are the Breonna Taylors, the Michael Browns, the Sandra Blands, and the list goes on. And you ask, what can be done? We got to do something. One thing that you didn't announce in my introduction, as you introduced me, I have a PhD from UCLA. And from those of you from New York, that means the university on the corner of Lenox Avenue in Harlem. And on that corner, played lots of games like freeze tag, hot peas and butter. Not sure the total audience, you may not know the name of some of those games, but there was also a game that often happened on that corner called Double Dutch. And what I want to say is that too many of us across the nation have been doing the double Dutch rock. And with double Dutch, you know, most of you know what that is. You're turning the ropes. We keep rocking back and forth, acting like we're going to jump in, but we never jump. What can higher institutions of higher learning do? They can jump in. They can do something. And this forum today is a start, right? Merely a start. Yes, it's great, as Dr. Newkirk said, that statues and monuments are coming down, and symbolism is truly important, but policy change is important. Radical inquiry is important. Uncomfortable conversations that lead to uncomfortable changes are important. And so I would say that what institutions of higher learning can do is get out of your comfort zone and understand after this reckoning moment, we have to rumble, we have to get uncomfortable, we have to be emotionally exposed. We have to be able to and wanting to do a reset. So I am grateful for this moment. And I think it's also important to note, while, again, I will say that I'm happy, and that's a wrong way to put it, right? We as a nation in this confluence of this perfect storm, I would venture to say, if it were not for the pandemic and millions of Americans at home, millions of Americans out, that George Floyd's murder, while captured on video, may have been confined to a regional blip in Minneapolis, but because so many of us were home, we were watching, we were dealing with the disparities of COVID-19, it was the spark that ignited this present, current movement for Black lives, right? But I think it's also important for all of us to understand that this is just not about police brutality. If we don't think big, if we don't act big and understand that this is also an opportunity for educational equity and justice on the education front, on environmental justice, criminal justice, that we are going to miss the moment we have. And I also, the nation know, and whoever's listening, that it is not the responsibility of Black people to end systemic racism. Black folks did not create this social construct, this social contract. It was created by ethos of white supremacy and a belief in white supremacy. And so while I truly believe that there's no cavalry coming to save the day in Black communities, we are the iconic leaders that we've been waiting for, the curators of the change we're seeking to see. It's not our responsibility to end this, right? And what I love and what I am seeing, and Dr. Newkirk said the same about this is a different moment. And I said, what we saw with Emmett Till igniting the civil rights movement, I think that we are in the middle of a movement for Black lives that is indeed different than what we saw in the 60s. It is a multi-generational, it is a multi-racial, multi-gender, and that it does encompass a wide range, right? And I think that we have to have to systemic racism, right? There is not one way. We have to galvanize leadership from the campus to the corner, to the boardroom, to the block, and in between. And when we look at institutions like the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we look at institutional racism, particularly in professed progressive institutions, there is a liberal threshold. I remember when I started at Open Society Foundations in 2008, we were supposed to be a 3-year campaign, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. Sometimes philanthropy takes a look at a generational, centuries-long issue and say, we're going to address this with a 3-year or 5-year, if you're lucky, grant-making cycle. And I remember us being just a 3-year campaign. But I also remember halfway through that 3-year term, being in a board meeting where our living donor, George Soros, said, I like what I see with the campaign.
I know we got a freeze cam going on there with Dr. Dove. I think everybody's seeing that. Shawn, hopefully you'll come back here in a second and we can get your closing comments, because you were definitely on a roll there. We want to get that. I need everyone that's on this call to be an active listener, because the enormity of the message and the brevity of time just doesn't give us the time to go back and unpack everything that everyone is saying, because there's some good content that's going on here. So don't be lost. I need you to be active in this conversation. And one of the things Dr. Dove said was that, I like his analogy about the double Dutch and everybody's hesitating. One thing people can do is jump in. And I know someone who is not hesitant to jump in, and that's our next panelist, Daryl Hines. For some reason, there just hasn't been a Hines that I haven't liked. These people are just great people. And Daryl is a graduate of UW Madison. He's the CEO of Hines Consulting, and I'm just going to set him up with this prompt and let him go and do what he does. Before we do that, Shawn, why don't you unmute your mic, and then we're going to conclude your statement before we get to Daryl Hines.
Okay, so I think that was a creative way of giving me the time sign to block me out. We can talk about that a little bit later, Grady. What I would say in this moment, in closing, that what we need to do is we need to take more risk, more radical self-inquiry. We need to tell our stories of what's happening across the nation. We need to act with urgency. And part of that urgency is the fierce urgency of empathy. Our democracy is on fire, and we have to act like we are dealing with a burning house. And we need to find places where we can get in, where there is already momentum. And the University of Wisconsin-Madison can be a model of what institutions of higher education can do after this gathering today. Got a lot more, but I will stop right there.
I know you do, Dr. Dove. I appreciate that. You got to take some risks. You got to be willing to jump in individually as well as systematically. You got to move with urgency. It's no time left to be wasted, and you got to capitalize on this momentum. In my book, that spells RUM all day long. Risk, urgency, and momentum. And I appreciate you sharing that with us, Dr. Dove. Hopefully we're going to get some more from you at the back end of our discussion. Again, talking about someone who is always, again, ready to take a risk and jump in is Daryl Hines. I told you he's the CEO of Hines Consulting, and I want to hear from him, being, a graduate of UW Madison. Why is it important for you to be a part of this conversation today, addressing the university's commitment to changing the Black experience on campus? Because I know that you were one of the architects of that experience, because what you did during your time there, that is being felt by students that are coming through now. So Brother Hines, why is it so important for you to be a part of this conversation today?
Grady, thank you so much. You're doing a phenomenal job moderating this conversation. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to have this conversation, because I firmly believe that conversations can be very productive in reaching a common goal. Constructive conversations can truly help in bridging the gap of understanding. You mentioned it earlier that there is a need for understanding. And I'm reminded of a scripture that says that in all thy getting, get an understanding. So my hope is that this is an opportunity to educate and enlighten one another. And as we begin to learn more about the conditions of the Black experience on campus, it will further ring the alarm for the need of tremendous progress. Personally, I feel a responsibility to use my voice and to use my experiences to persuade people and to help them understand that there has to be more action. We have to move the needle of change. I remember after graduating, I told myself if I was ever given the opportunity to come back to help improve the UW experience for Black students that I would do it. I even actually started writing a book. And what I realized was that me writing about my experiences and me reflecting on some of the things that I went through as a part of the body of students on UW's campus, it was therapeutic for me. The book was called Memoirs of a Black Man on a White Campus. And the challenges that we face regarding race relations on UW's campus, they have been established over a long period of time, which lets us know that the necessary changes won't happen overnight. But we also know that if we start today, we can begin creating a better environment for the next generation. In spite of the challenges, I am still an advocate for UW. I love being a Badger. I wear my Badger badge very proudly. I had two first cousins that I was really advocating for them to go to UW, and they decided that they wanted to attend the University of Wisconsin. Morgan Hines, she graduated not too long ago, and now she's in law school at Marquette University. And another cousin of mine, Devin Hines, is at the Yale Business School while interning at Google. And that's the wonderful part about receiving an education at UW, is that it opens the doors of opportunity across the globe. I have 3 children myself. I have a boy and 2 girls, a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And I would absolutely love for them to attend UW. And I think that it's important that I do my part to ensure that they and other Black children of their generation have a UW experience that is free of prejudice and racial injustice. And we all know that there's a long list of things that need to happen to create a new normal at UW. But there are a few things that I'd like to see happen to help further embrace Black students on campus. The first thing is I would love to see more pipelines and programming to recruit Black students. Now, I am a product of the People program, which is a phenomenal program. I think it's a wonderful opportunity in recruiting Black students. But what we have to understand is that 1 program, 2 programs, 3 programs is just not enough. Because you have to realize during my time there were approximately 50,000 students, and 1% of that being students of color. Now that percentage included athletes across basketball, football, track and field, which further isolated students of academia. And part of human nature is the innate desire to be around people you can relate to, people who look like you, people who understand you, and people that can easily connect with you. I've been born and raised in the church my entire life. My grandfather was a pastor. My father is a pastor. I serve as an associate pastor at our church now. And something that I find very interesting about the church is that you have Black churches and you have white churches, but of the same denomination. This is interesting to me because we know that church is a place for all people and that God isn't a God of one particular race of people, but yet you find people that will choose to worship with those that they are most comfortable with, those who they connect best with culturally. I believe that it's close to impossible for us to expect students of color to want to attend a university where they can't see themselves and receive an education in an environment that doesn't truly reflect who they are. So that would be number 1 for me, create more pipelines and programming to recruit Black students. Number 2 would be create more systems of support for Black students. I remember my first week on campus at UW, I was in my dorm room crying. I called my dad and I begged him to let me come home. I was culture shocked. I felt alone. I felt isolated. I was unhappy. I felt lost. And I believe that if UW is going to be more embracing of Black students, then they have to let Black students know that they see them and that they hear them. They have to let them know that they are there to create opportunities, to cultivate their experience, that they have built social infrastructures, educational infrastructures, informational infrastructures to support that care. So that would be the second thing, is I believe that they need to create more systems of support for students of color. And then last but not least, probably most importantly, is that there has to be zero tolerance for acts of racism on campus. During my experience at UW, I've had several racist encounters, from my landlord making racial comments to a professor openly and wrongfully accusing me of cheating, to having my vehicle urinated on by another student. These are real experiences that I went through during my time on campus. These experiences will forever be with me. They will stick with me. They are part of my journey. And I do know that UW, they speak out against acts of racism, but having a zero tolerance means that extreme measures are put into place to thoroughly communicate that intolerance, communicate the consequences, and investigate an acts of racism to the fullest extent. It has to be known that this isn't funny, it's not cute, and it's not a game when we start to talk about acts of prejudice and racism. And in closing, there's a quote that says, "Change cannot happen until those who are not affected by injustice are just as outraged by those who are." And I hope that those who are in positions of power at UW are outraged at the continuous cycle of prejudice and racial unjust acts that take place on campus. I hope that they are listening and truly ready to commit to change, because commitment says that regardless of what it takes, how difficult it may be, we are here to see it to the end. Commitment doesn't get distracted by critics, nor does it default partway to the goal. Commitment is unconditional and laser focused. We have to be committed with beyond just our words, but we have to be committed with our resources and our actions. And I believe that UW can be a thought leader in yet another space. And I also believe that if they get this right, or when they get this right, this will be a model that can serve to share with other institutions across America. And that's why it's important for me to be a part of this conversation, addressing the university's commitment to changing the Black experience on campus.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's Daryl Hines giving his perspective, and a quite eloquent perspective in that 2003 graduate, UW-Madison. And again, I need you to be active listeners here, because Daryl gave some very concrete steps and action items that people can take, including on the university level. We always talk about in our community work, kids can't be what they can't see. And if a kid cannot see themselves at UW-Madison, you're going to have a leaky pipeline in terms of the transformation and the matriculation of students there. If I don't see myself in your promotional materials, if I don't see myself in your professorships, if I don't see myself in your student organizations, other than just on the athletic field, is not looking like a very welcoming example. So if Brother Hines represents old school, and I know I'm really old if I talk about 2003 grads being old school, we have a new school perspective, if you will, and that is our next panelist, Payton Wade. Payton is a 2020 graduate. She's seeing crystal clear. She's 2020 class of 2020 UW-Madison. She was the founder of the UW-Madison Student Inclusion Council. I have the pleasure of serving with both Daryl Hines and Payton Wade on the Executive Diversity Council for the UW-Madison Division of Diversity, Equity, and Educational Achievement. And I want to get Payton's perspective here in terms of, Payton, what made it challenging for you as a Black student, as a Black female on the campus of a predominantly white institution, even when you were leading on campus, you were a leader on campus, and you were a leader in your community? What were some of the challenges that you had at UW-Madison?
Yeah, thank you, Grady. It's good to see you and hear from you again. I also want to thank Tracy for the opportunity to speak with you all today. But I would say as a Black student at a PWI, a few things that are challenging is just the stress and the uncertainty that comes with speaking out against the racism that happens on campus. Back in October, I spoke out about the homecoming video that was released. And with that came a lot of backlash that I had to deal with. And everyone knows that being a student is already a very difficult task to balance, especially at such a rigorous school such as University of Wisconsin-Madison. And to put on top of that, having to deal with the stress of people talking about you for speaking out against something that you believe in is very difficult. I dealt with backlash on the internet, on social media, with people saying that I didn't deserve to be at UW-Madison or I should just go to a different school. I had to deal with backlash in person where people look at you funny or you hear the whispers about, you know, that's the person who did this. But it takes a toll on you mentally. And also it can like physically as well. I know the current president of the Wisconsin Black Student Union is kind of facing some of that same backlash for the way she's been speaking up and also calling the university out for the different issues that she's been facing. And I think also one reason that I feel like I've been able to push my agenda is because of the support that I had from Black women in power, such as Dr. Gittens, Dr. Charleston, who were there supporting me through all of this. And I think that's something that not all students have the opportunity to experience who do speak up against issues like this. And I just want to thank them specifically because they made it bearable for me to continue to speak up and continue to fight for what I believed in when it came to the issues that I had to face on campus. But I think even though it's difficult to speak up in like any sense, but especially at a predominantly white institution, I would encourage students to continue to do so. There are so many students on campus right now who are continuously fighting for our voices to be heard, who are really trying to make a change on the campus of UW-Madison, and are also working with those in leadership and administration to make sure that we do work towards something where we can all feel comfortable on campus and we build a better community. Even though as an alum now in a different position, it's been great to kind of work with the Alumni Association, to also work with the administration to continue to make that change. So I do want to commend the university on the different things that they've been doing because I do definitely see that change coming. It's unfortunate that I'm not there to be able to really benefit from it, but I just want to continue to encourage all students, anyone who's listening to this right now, and also alum, such as like DJ's doing, to just continue to support us, recent grads, and also people who are currently there, because DJ graduated in 2003. I graduated in 2020, and we're still facing those same issues that he mentioned. I have a lot of stories similar to that over 15 years later. So I do think the university is making those steps to really create change, such as doing things such as a call like this. But I just want to continue to support students to speak out. It's worth it, and you will see everything happen in return. And I just want to thank the university as well for all they've been doing and for this opportunity to speak to you all today.
Thank you so much, Payton. Very well said. I appreciate hearing your perspective. I went to Howard University undergrad, so for me, you know, it's hard for me to fathom kind of what you and DJ talked about in terms of, you know, having ownership on campus, because, you know, we look at the whole thing as ours, but that's going to be important. And Payton may have to leave us. Payton is about to start her new job. She's going to Dallas, and I know she has a flight to catch. So Payton, we wish you well, and thank you so much for your participation today. We got to stop exporting this talent too. We need Payton to be here in Wisconsin, a state that she's passionate about, around still impacting what's going on at our alma mater as well. We're going to try to keep it moving, and I'm seeing some great comments come through on the chat line as well. Please keep your comments coming through. We're going to figure out how we address these. Right now, we have another UWM graduate, and in the persons of Cavalier Johnson, who's going to speak to us. Cavalier Johnson is the 2nd District Alderman and new Common Council President for the city of Milwaukee. Every time you turn on public access TV, you see Cavalier Johnson running some meeting or another. I had the pleasure of working with him on some of our community initiatives at Johnson Controls, and so happy that you're with us here today, Common Council President. Want to ask you to kind of take it from a different perspective. You know, what are some of the similarities you see? We've been talking about a PWI, predominantly white institution like UW-Madison. You are leading, you know, one of the largest cities in the Midwest. And one of the questions that came through in the chat was, you know, why is there an absence of, you know, white males? We don't see white males here. They are definitely needed as allies. I think Shawn Dove talked about the fact that this is not an issue. This whole issue that we're talking about is not for Black people alone to solve. Black people alone didn't create it, and Black people alone can't solve it. But in order to get the allies, we need to continue to create these dialogues so we can develop some understanding. But what are some of the similarities you see between running a city like Milwaukee, which some would say is one of the more segregated cities in the country? Some would say that it's just, you know, very neighborhood dependent, if you will. But some would call that reliance on neighborhood segregation. What would you say are some of the similarities in trying to create understanding and move public agendas forward for the benefit of them all, as we're talking about right now with the University of Wisconsin at Madison?
Well, thank you, Grady. First of all, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me fine?
Hear you perfectly.
Excellent. We had some technical difficulties, so I just wanted to make sure that we were on board here. So first of all, I want to say thank you to you and Tracy and everybody participating today, and for providing me with the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I love UW-Madison. It's one of the reasons why I selected to go to the university. And anytime I get the chance, even today, to visit Madison, I always make sure that I stop over at some of my old stomping grounds on campus. The question that you asked about the similarities between Milwaukee and Madison in terms of segregation is something that is striking to me, because when I look at my experience at UW-Madison, and of course my experience growing up here in Milwaukee, I understand that there is an issue in terms of diversity. I remember years ago when I had the opportunity to participate in a pre-college program that was at the time run by the YMCA of Metropolitan Milwaukee, called Sponsor a Scholar, with the goal of getting low-income students in Milwaukee public schools off to college, to be the first people in their family to graduate from college. And I did that by attending UW-Madison. When I got to Madison, I noticed something that I expressed to some of the other students that were participating in our annual winter conference. And that was that there was not very much diversity. There were not very many spaces for people of color on the university. I recall saying in my younger days during that time, reflecting on the experience, and it was always snowing in Madison, and it wasn't fall with the multiple colors of the leaves in terms of the population of people at the university. So that's something that struck out to me. In Milwaukee, we do have this stigma of being a segregated city, but I think people should understand as well that it's not just the city of Milwaukee that we should be talking about. We should be talking about the metropolitan Milwaukee area. Some people should know, and I think some people do know, that the city of Milwaukee is a 65% person of color. We have a huge African-American population, about 40%. It's about 40% white. We've got about 17% Latinos that live in the city of Milwaukee. We have one of the largest populations of Hmong people in the United States. that live in the city of Milwaukee as well, including in my aldermanic district that I represent. So, but it's when you go out to the surrounding communities in the Milwaukee area where you see that stagnant historical segregation, and that's perpetuated, these days, even with lack of access to job opportunities, lack of access to public transportation, and the like, to communities that surround the city of Milwaukee. So I see some of the same sort of similarities on campus, or at least in my time there. And I graduated in 2009, so I spent 4 years from 2005 to 2009 there. It seemed to me like the more central part of the campus, near Memorial Union and down to University and the like, was the area where there were most opportunities and spaces for people of color. But when you go out to the fringes of the university, up by the lakeshore, even some of the areas down on Langdon Street, it became less and less diverse. And that's something that the university, I think, needs to grapple with and make sure that there are spaces for all people, particularly people of color and students who are Black, to have access to. I remember when I went to SOAR back in the day, and everybody raising their hands about where they're from in the state and all that, and I looked around and I was the only person of color in the room. And people of color, many times, when we attend a school like Madison, we're the first person in our family to go to college. And so you're attending SOAR, and everybody's got their parents there. And I'm sitting there without my parents. They didn't know the importance of being there because they never had attended college. And so that, I think, is a way for the university to step up and say, hey, there probably is a need for extra support for students of color that are admitted to the university in a program like this. So there are a number of things in terms of diversity and segregation that the university could take a leading stance on. And as DJ said, being a template, I think that other universities across the country could look to for inspiration and to change some of their policies and procedures as well.
Perfect. President Johnson, it's always good to get those perspective of those who've kind of, walked those hallways, those streets, to understand what's going on. And in your role now, I appreciate your insights in terms of the similarities and some of the concrete action steps that the university can take as well. I want to, have you stay with us because I'm sure there's going to be some follow-up questions for you as well. But I want to transition here to Dr. Ruben Anthony, another one of our panelists. Dr. Anthony is the president and the CEO of the Urban League of Greater Madison. And the question that we have teed up for Dr. Anthony this morning is around the town gown connections. And for some of you that may not be familiar with that term, town and gown are two distinct communities of a university town, if you will. Town being the non-academic population, and gown metaphorically being the university community, if you will. So Dr. Anthony, thank you again for being here. And could you talk to us for a few minutes about the town gown connections and the community when it comes to racism and your role with the Urban League of Madison in trying to address and bridge those gaps between the university community and the town community?
Definitely. Thank you, Grady. And thank you, Dr. Gittens and Tracy and the rest of the panelists for being here today. So I am also an alumni of the University of Wisconsin. I finished up a master's degree in urban planning at the University of Wisconsin, I believe in 1992. So this social isolation that many of the students have talked about and not feeling like you belong on the campus, I experienced that directly. But similar to some other people, I had the opportunity to go to a HBC. I went to Jackson State for my first master's degree. So I know how a university is supposed to treat Black people and how you can really feel proud to be on a campus and feel connected to campus. So I've been in Madison for 33 years. I came here in 1988. I've been with the Urban League for 5 years as their president and CEO. And, when things happen on campus, it catches our attention in the community. And when things happen in the community, it catches the attention on campus. But typically, the young people on campus will reach out because many of them go to the churches in our community. A lot of our folks on campus go to Mount Zion Baptist Church, where I'm a deacon there, and so and there's services that are held on campus. So naturally, when something goes down on campus, they reach out to us. But also, there are fraternities and sororities, on campus. And those organizations are connected to people in the community. So when something happens on campus, you'll have a frat brother or a sorority sister calling saying, hey, you need to check us out because this is what's happening. And then again, there's the connections of friends and family. Coincidentally, Willie Hines is a friend of mine from Milwaukee, and his daughter was on campus, and she would reach out to, and Willie would reach out, former alderman in Milwaukee, to say there's some issues on campus that you should know about. Payton Wade, her dad, former Alder Wade, would reach out the same way, and he would say, hey, my daughter's into something on campus, or they got something going on. And then again, many of the young people that have grown up in the community, they know of the Urban League, they know of the NAACP, and they come out, and they reach out because they know that we are supposed to be these institutional organizations that watch over civil rights and to ensure that they are not being discriminated against anywhere, whether it's on campus or whether it's in the city. And then again, community leaders like me, we pay attention, we watch, and we make sure that the campus knows that we're watching what goes on campus. I have the opportunity to serve on the Chancellor's Advisory Committee. So when things happen, I get a phone call typically from the Chancellor, or I'll put a phone call into the Chancellor to say that these are some of the things that are happening. And so Madison has had numerous incidents of racism, on their campus. And when those things have happened, we have weighed in different ways. For example, there's a young man named Denzel McDonald who was arrested for tagging, his name on a building. African-American young man. He was in graduate school. They charged him with 11 criminal charges. And but in contrast, there's another young man on campus who spit, in a Black girl's face. His name was Matthew Heiss, and he spit in Synovia Knox's face and pushed some of her friends. And he didn't get any charge. He didn't get any charge at all. He got, I think, a citation for disorderly conduct. So on campus, there's some unequal justice going on. And when we see that, we weigh in. We weighed in on the Denzel McDonald case, and he ended up getting a restorative option opposed to the 11 charges. But had we not spoke up and say, we see what's going on, and we're not going to let that happen, this brilliant young man would not be going on to finish his PhD, and I think he might have done that by now, because he was going to get this unequal justice, laid out on him. And then we had a situation on campus where at a football game, in the middle of a football game, someone was dressed in a Barack Obama mask, and they had a noose hanging around his neck. And so you wonder, like right in the middle of the football game, how comfortable could someone be to kind of to exercise this act of hate, and I think they got kicked out of the football game and other things. And then the last thing that we had happen on campus was Quintez Cephas was accused of sexually assaulting a young lady, and the university was going to ruin this guy's football career. And so, we weighed in against that to say he deserves to have a fair trial, and the university should not be interfering, and we were able to help in those situations. But we continue to have to reach out to campus, and they continue to reach out to us on different issues. There's a lot of issues going on, on campus, and in the sense of the different types of racism. We have implicit bias going on campus, where you've got folks saying, well, we didn't know that act was a racist act that we were doing. You have structural bias going on, where the racism is perpetuated, whether it's people change jobs or stay in their jobs. For example, the perpetuation of racism is where African Americans don't get tenure enough, or we don't have enough success in graduation from different departments. And then we have just explicit bias where people are just flat out racist, like with the Barack Obama situation. And so there are a lot of changes that we need to happen on campus. But what we in the community want young people to know is that if you reach out to us, we'll be there for you, and we're watchful anyway. And so, so that campus and community connection is there, and it's transparent because the kids are not just exclusive to campus. They attend activities in the community at large. So I'll stop there and be prepared to answer questions at the back end.
Dr. Anthony, I appreciate that perspective, and I'm just so glad to hear that the kids have advocates like you, because as President Johnson talked about, and DJ talked about it as well, for Black students, a lot of times it may be first generation that's arriving on campus and may not know exactly what protocols should be in place or what they should have to tolerate, and the things that they don't need to tolerate, like the incidents that you talked about, the football game, and I've heard of that before, was totally appalling to me. And I heard some rumblings as it had been, kind of chalked up as free speech. And I'm just gonna, put a dime in the meter and make this public service announcement for anybody who cares to listen. But, for instance, at Johnson Controls, I may not ever be able to change what you think and your attitudes. And that's not necessarily what I'm trying to do. But your behavior when you are on the campus of Johnson Controls is going to be regulated by the views and values of Johnson Controls. So we can't allow you to come into our stadium, into our place of employment with a Barack Obama mask and a noose around your neck under the auspices of free speech, because we control the culture that we're trying to create. Let me get off my horse and move this thing ahead, because we have Claudia Marte, who's going to talk about, and so appropriate at this time, judging by what Dr. Anthony just talked about, trauma. And these incidences that we talk about create trauma, and they've been happening in the lives of Black and Brown people from our earliest existence. And so Claudia Marte is the mental health provider. She's with the Students of Color Focus at UW-Madison, and wanted her to address what are some of the elements of historical trauma related to the Black community, and especially even as it relates to this whole debate and debacle, if you will, between All Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter, which tends to dismiss or invalidate experience of trauma that our Black and Brown kids have experienced throughout their existence. Claudia Marte.
All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay. So good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm grateful for sharing this time. And thank you, Tracy, for inviting me. I'm here today because of my passion for helping others. I've lived in Madison for over 15 years now, so I guess this is my home. And my own personal experiences growing up as a Black Latina in Brooklyn, New York in the late 80s, so you could kind of tell from my age then, seeing how poverty and systematic racism impacted the lives of the people in my community. I realized I wouldn't have been able to achieve my educational and career goals without the sacrifice of my family, my neighbors, key teachers who encouraged me in my educational journey, and the peers I lost due to gun violence and drugs in my community. Mental health was not even on my radar until I took my first psychology and sociology course and began to have names and concepts and theories to all the stories of the symptoms I saw around me in my community. My work now involves holding space for others and letting them talk about very personal pieces of themselves and challenges they are facing. So getting back to the question of trauma, why is this important? And I believe we can't talk about what's happening today without revisiting the historical context of living in the US while Black. Historical trauma is an example of intergenerational trauma. It's caused by events that target a group of people, and even family members who have not directly experienced a trauma can feel the effects of the events generations later. While the area of generational trauma is still a developing psychological theory, researchers like the amazing Dr. Joy DeGruy, with over 12 years of research, have paved the way for necessary conversations about the socialization of trauma in Black communities. And I wanted to talk about specifically about post-traumatic slave syndrome. This is a condition that exists as a consequence of centuries of slavery, followed by institutionalized racism and oppression that has resulted in multi-generational adaptive behaviors. Some positive, reflecting resilience, and others that are harmful and destructive. So throughout history, we see the internal pieces of bias, privilege, internalized racism, and the external pieces of interpersonal, how we deal with one another, institutional and structural pieces. And both internal and external are tied by power and economics. Psychological science suggests that people who have experienced race-based stress and trauma frequently have similar experiences to people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. This distress can include flashbacks, hypervigilance, nightmares, heart palpitations, poor sleep, and anxiety. But where PTSD can be caused by one single event, racial stress is ongoing, it's pervasive, it's generationally transmitted and affects both individuals and collective communities. And so beyond the PTSD symptoms, racial trauma is enduring and re-triggering. So in the recent months, Black people have been repeatedly reminded of the risks involved when they interact with police, been repeatedly exposed to videos of Black men and women being murdered, and seen a police response or military response to communities protesting these abuses. These experiences are piled onto the daily experiences of direct and indirect systemic racism. And the cumulative effect of these experiences can have a serious damaging impact on the mental health and physical health of Black people. Psychological scientists have come to describe this impact as racial trauma. And I wanted to wrap my thoughts, because I know we're over time here today, with how we can take this information and make long-lasting changes so that we can truly create spaces where Black students can feel welcome. My position as a student mental health provider with a student of color focus came from the advocacy of UW students. We have a lot of work to do, and it is my hope that this call of action spearheads everlasting changes to make Black students feel like they can truly take up space freely on campus and grow without racism and judgment of others.
Thank you so much, Claudia. You got to the end so quick on me. I didn't have a chance to trigger up my camera again, but just powerful again as to why that's needed. And we know that you were going to be tag teaming with Dr. Corey Steele, and he was going to talk about racism and microaggressions. And I think that we're having some technical difficulties with regard to Dr. Steele. So we're going to keep it moving. As you mentioned, we are behind schedule. No thanks to me. But we do have with us Dr. Eric Wilcox, who is the Dean of the College of Letters and Science, of the Mary C. Jacoby Professor of Astronomy for the UW-Madison campus. Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much for being with us today. And wanted to ask you again a very specific question about the experience at UWM. How does the University of Wisconsin-Madison address issues of racism, diversity, and inclusion on campus while educating and supporting the broader community? Can you talk to us for a few minutes on that topic?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thank you for the opportunity. And want to make sure I'm being heard, so you can.
You are being heard, and I see Dr. Steele with us. Dr. Steele, hold on, we'll come back to you. Dr. Wilcox is going to address this question we just posed to him, but Dr. Steele, thanks for joining us. We'll be with you in 1 second.
Great, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be with the great panel Thanks for all the folks who are participating remotely in this event. I think it's a fantastic event, and want to give a thanks to Cheryl and her team for putting this on. It's a big question that you've asked, one that will take a lot longer than the time that we have today to try to answer. But a bit about my background. I was just named the Dean of the College of Letters and Science about a month ago. So this is my second month of being in the job permanently, as they say. I was the interim dean prior to that, and served in the LNS administration for the better part of a decade, partly as the associate dean for natural mathematical sciences. I got my PhD at the University of Washington many years ago, and through my professional career, I have very much been the only Black person in the room. Astronomy is not one of those disciplines that has a lot of diversity, and so a lot of the things that we've heard today are things that resonate with me quite strongly. But I want to point out a couple of things. I think areas where, as a campus and certainly as a college of letters and science, where we must be a lot better and can be a lot better. And a lot of these things have come up in our conversations today. And I think there's sort of four areas that I want to speak to. One is the diversification of our people. And we have spent some time this morning talking about how do we grow pipelines and diversify our student body. A lot of that focus has been on the undergraduate experience, but I also want in that conversation to think about our graduate students. We need to make sure that we have a diverse pool of graduate students. I'm going to get back to that in a moment. Many times on campus, when we think about diversity programs and initiatives, we think about our faculty and our students. And so we do think a lot about how do we diversify, recruit, and retain a diverse group of faculty. We need to do that. I'll talk about that in a bit. But we also cannot forget our staff. And that includes the blue collar jobs, but also that broad pool of individuals who provide the academic support, who handle HR, who handle research services. That staff is critical to making the university function, and that is where we also need to focus attention on making sure our diversity efforts are strong. So we need to do that. How do we go about doing that? And I think that's one of our challenges, is to making sure that we have these conversations, but make sure we have some action and things that we can do and things that we must do. While we have a number of programs and those are working, there's the top program, for example, that works on faculty. Some of our departments have developed programs to recruit diverse pools of graduate students, but I want to highlight a couple of things where I think we can make meaningful change. One is that we have to be in a position to make sure that our departments and units are in a position to redefine what excellence looks like. And this has been a challenge, I think, for academia for a very long time. Academia is a lowercase c conservative institution. Change is difficult. And so we have to make sure that we are taking the steps and bringing our departments on board to redefine what excellence looks like. And that means looking in different places that they are not used to looking, recruiting people that they are not used to recruiting, and making the efforts to bring people and allow them to grow and be successful here on our campus. So that's one thing. And I think that's particularly appropriate to graduate students and our faculty. And I think on the pipelines and in connections, we have to make sure that we are making meaningful and lasting collaborations with the HBCUs and other minority serving institutions. We have not done that as well at the institutional level as I think we can. A number of members of the panel are graduates of HBCUs. We need to make sure that we're connecting with those HBCUs in a meaningful way, both intellectually, but also in terms of thinking about recruiting talent to come to our campus as graduate students, postdocs, faculty, staff, etc. So we have to make a lot of efforts there in diversifying our people, our students, our faculty, and our staff. We also have to think about inclusion and how do we make sure that everyone on our campus, particularly Blacks and brown people, are included and feel like this is a place where they can be successful. I have had a very successful career here at UW-Madison, and I want to make sure everyone who looks like me also has that experience. So how are we going to do that? As has been brought up this morning, one of the places where we have some control is our classrooms. We have to make sure that our teaching staff, our teaching assistants, our academic staff who are in the classrooms, and our faculty are prepared and trained to be able to have the most inclusive classroom practices they possibly can. It was mentioned earlier that it's really hard to change attitudes. It is. It's really hard to change attitudes, but we can change behaviors. We can educate the educators so that they understand what it means to walk into a diverse classroom and how to make sure that all of the students who are in that class feel like they belong in that class, feel welcome in that class, feel like they have a voice in that class and can be successful in that class. That will take concerted effort at training, concerted effort at making sure our people can have difficult conversations and building up a cadre of instructors who understand what it means to have an inclusive classroom. So that's something that we need to be able to do. Education, one of the challenges and one of that we heard about earlier today is that some of the problems on our campus are the same problems today as they were 15 years ago, as they were 30 years ago. One of the reasons for that is that our undergraduate students are always turning over, right? Every year we have a new cohort of 7,000 freshmen coming into the university. We have to make sure that what we now call our ethnic studies requirement is strong enough and robust enough so that each new student who comes onto our campus gets that kind of education early in their careers here. So they understand the history, they understand what diversity means, they understand racial injustice, and they have that awareness earlier in the undergraduate careers that will carry them through. And so we're actually on campus in a number of different places right now, thinking about how do we bolster and strengthen that ethnic studies requirement. I mentioned earlier about educating the educators. There's a small area where if we want to think about lasting change and something where we can have an impact downstream and in the long term, and I think we've got to recognize our role, particularly in our graduate education, that we are graduating students who come out with masters and PhDs who are going on to be leaders in their disciplines or leaders in industry. We have to make sure that those graduate students are prepared to take up that mantle of leadership and to take up the challenge of being able to change their disciplines. One of the actually truly sort of inspirational things I have seen over the past 2 months is the response of graduate students across all disciplines in wanting to see their departments change, wanting to see their disciplines change. And I think that's inspirational. We have to build on that, and we have to make sure that our students are prepared to enter into that world and become leaders in their disciplines. I think there are ways we can do that. I've had some conversations recently about having graduate seminars for our graduate students, not so much around their disciplines, but around leadership in the disciplines of what it means to affect change. So we have to be able to do that. The more difficult challenge is one that all the alums have alluded to, and that is to making sure that our students feel welcome and feel that they can be successful. Personally, I believe that part of this starts really at the local level. And we need to work with our departments and our units to make sure that at the local level, they are doing the things that they need to do to welcome all students bring students into being successful. And so that's something that we need to work on. Third thing I want to mention very briefly is research. We're a Research One institution. We have a lot of really smart people on this campus who are working on and are thought leaders in subjects that touch on the issues that we have raised here this morning that are very, very at the forefront of our minds. We have to empower those individuals to turn that research into policy action that we can then affect change more broadly. That is a great thing about being in a research institution. And so we've got to make sure that we are supporting and investing in that research that allows, again, that change in policy at the local, the state, the national level. That can affect change more broadly. So we have to invest in our research. And the last thing that I want to mention is our community relations. And I think this call sort of represents, I think, part of a weakness that we have. And that weakness is, and I will pick on Johnson Controls as an example of that. Over the past couple of years, I have been in a number of conversations with leadership at Johnson Controls and the partnership between the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Johnson Controls around research, around our facilities, and around talent acquisition. That conversation has not been about racial justice and how do we collectively make our communities better. And I think as we think about our partnerships at that institutional level, we have to make sure that the issues that we are talking about here today are part of those partnerships that we are making, be it with the Johnson Controls, be it with an American Family or an Epic or smaller companies in the area and around the state, because we're in this together. The goals of UW-Madison to have to end racial injustice and to have a diverse and inclusive community are the same goals of our private sector partners. We need to change the Madison schools. We need to change the Milwaukee schools. We need to change that tremendous racial inequality that we see in the state of Wisconsin. We can't do that individually. And we can't do that by having this kind of conversation at the side. It's got to be core to the partnerships that we're building around the state. And I think that's an area where we can be much better. And so I want to leave you with two thoughts. One is one I think is very depressing. And I had this conversation last week with Tracy as we were talking about this mythology of Midwest nice and the area that we are in. If you look at socioeconomic measures and you ask yourself which states have the largest gap on those socioeconomic measures between whites and blacks, those states are in the upper Midwest. It's Wisconsin, it's Minnesota, it's Iowa, it's Illinois. That is where the gaps are the largest. So it's a collective effort that we need to narrow those gaps. And that's something that we need to do together. And on the positive side of things, I'm going to disagree a little bit with our moderator who started out by talking about how 2020 was a year that isn't going well. It's tragic. It is absolutely tragic. But I think might end up, and if we do the right things, end up being one of the most consequential years that we've seen in a very long time. Because I think we have an opportunity before us to really affect change and leave 2020 in a much better place moving forward with a lot of that momentum that we've talked about earlier. And so I want to be an optimist and say, let's take this moment, let's take the challenge, let's move forward collectively to solve these challenges. So thank you.
Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much. You knocked it out the park. You left so much meat on that bone, we can't even come back to feast on it because of time. But I mean, you really laid it out. You laid out some action steps, some things that we can do. You even challenged Johnson Controls, and I appreciate that as well, because the corporate community does need to look at this different. The Business Roundtable has already kind of restated the purpose of the corporation, and it has to be broader than just delivering values for shareholders. It has to have the community's interest and advancement at heart. So we need to have those broader conversations with UW-Madison as well. I need to continue to move this along. Thank you again, Dr. Wilcox. We have Dr. Steele with us now. Dr. Corey Steele is a psychologist, mental health provider, students of color with the Students of Color focus at UW-Madison, and kind of piggybacking on what Claudia Marte talked about in terms of trauma. I want to pose this question to Dr. Steele in terms of racism, and how does racism and microaggression affect mental and physical health? Because this is an issue that people don't, look at or don't take seriously, but we know when people deal with some of the things that some of the students talked about today, it impacts them and can impact their safety as well, because they're dealing with more than just what presents to one's eye. And when we are interacting with people, we at least need to have some understanding that there's more to the person than what we're observing on the surface. Dr. Steele, can you take it from there?
Sure thing. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Yes. Really happy to be with you all today. Really grateful to be a part of this incredibly important conversation. And really, we could take another 2 hours talking about the effects of racism. I'll start by saying that racism is certainly implicated in the development of things like hypertension, stroke, cardiovascular disease. Obviously, overt forms of racism like physical attacks can lead to bodily injury. When we talk about the effects of racism on mental health, racism can lead to things like depression, increased stress, isolation, substance abuse, suicidal ideation, increased anxiety, for example. And racism can unfortunately do much more than that. It can really work to diminish a person's sense of self, lower self-esteem, silence one's voice, and lower a person's life satisfaction. Unfortunately, I missed my colleague Claudia's response to her question earlier, but if we haven't talked about race-based trauma or racial trauma, that's certainly important to talk about as well. And so when we talk about racial trauma or race-based trauma, we're really talking about the emotional, psychological, and physical reactions to harassment, discrimination. All of these things, of course, cause pain. And so reactions to racial trauma can really mimic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're thinking of symptoms like hypervigilance, hyper-awareness of your surroundings, avoidance of people or places, or even things that maybe remind you of the racist injury, the race-based stressor, flashbacks, nightmares, and then also, again, heightened anxiety. And one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind when we talk about racial trauma is, despite the beliefs of some, like encountering racism isn't necessarily this like experience where you're momentarily impacted and then things go away. In many cases, we're talking about a long-term effect or impact from racism. Another thing that I'd like to say about racial trauma is that there's growing research that suggests that not only can a person be impacted by their own encounter with racism, but they can also be impacted by witnessing someone else suffer a race-based traumatic stressor. So watching a video, for example, of someone using a racial slur against another person, watching a video of law enforcement assaulting and or killing a Black person would be examples. I want to go back and touch a bit on racial microaggressions. I would imagine that most in our audience know what we're talking about when we're talking about microaggressions. But Sue and his colleagues talked about racial microaggressions as these brief, kind of commonplace indignities that can be intentional or unintentional, that communicate things like hostility, degradation. These things really work to hurt, to impact people. And so to give you a personal example, to bring it home, as a graduate student, I was approached by one of the professors in my department who wanted to extend an invitation for like a research project. It could have been good for me because I needed the experience. And as a graduate student, I certainly needed the extra money. But she framed it as, this experience would be good for you because you're Black. And well, I think if you asked her, she would say, well, my intentions were good. I think you would be good for this thing. I thought I was presenting you with an opportunity. But also, I think in the way that was communicated to me, there was a certain limitation, I think, that she communicated in regards to my abilities, my value, and the way that I could contribute. Most of the students that I work with are self-identified students of color, work with many self-identified Black students. And those students have shared so many examples with me of racial microaggressions and other racist encounters that they've experienced on campus. So, talking about peers saying things to them like, well, the only reason that you're at UW is because the institution needs more diversity and you're a person of color or you're Black. So really sort of minimizing the person's talents and value. I've had so many students talk to me about having to defend their lived experiences in classrooms with both teachers and professors. I can think of examples where students have shared with me where their white peers have said things to them like, students of color have so many advantages now, and you're not the disadvantage, so to speak, on campus anymore. It's white students. You know, we heard a powerful example today of not being included in campus materials or celebrations like homecoming. And so these unfortunately are really damaging and frequent stories that I hear from the students that I have the great pleasure of working with.
Yes, very good, and very kind. Thank you so much for that perspective. We have just about elapsed our time, and so the program would say that I'm supposed to go back and give some recap of the discussions. No, it's not going to happen because we're out of time. We've had so much content in front of you. My hope, my charge to you is that you've gotten something that you can take away and put into action. I've been telling you as we've been going along, I needed you to be active listeners. You know, so I don't want you to go away and say, I didn't get anything out of that presentation today. Well, what you get out of it will be in direct proportion to what you put into it. And when I say that, I mean that all these people that you see on your screen right now are highly accessible people. And they've given some great perspectives and some great action items. And whatever resonates with you, I would encourage you to follow up with them directly, whether it's through UW-Madison, through social media, for someone like the Common Council President Johnson, highly accessible people here. But I do want to go back to Dr. Newkirk and ask her a question in follow-up to her opening statements. It seems like almost yesterday now. But I think this is really important when we talk about D&I initiatives that Dr. Newkirk opened up talking about and the failed case of D&I. And maybe, and it kind of dovetails with some of the things that Dr. Wilcox talked about in terms of educating the educators on why it's important to change the culture, especially in light of the turnover that you all talked about. You got 8,000 new freshmen coming in on campus annually. However, they come into a system. They don't create new. So they should be coming into a culture that has this zero tolerance for racism that Daryl Hines talked about. They should be coming into a culture that understands the importance of why an educational institution like UW-Madison has to be a place where everyone can see themselves from the classroom to the board of directors. And so, Dr. Newkirk, how do you incorporate this business case for diversity? Because maybe that's one thing that we haven't talked about. How do you incorporate the business case for D&I in this conversation and provide, if you will, maybe a concrete step or two that would equate that to economic growth or student growth as a cornerstone for this call to action that we're talking about? Dr. Newkirk?
Yeah, well, practically every study that's been done on the business case for diversity has shown that diversity both drives innovation and it increases the bottom line. Diversity just makes us smarter. It illuminates blind spots that we all have. It just will allow us to see the world a lot more clearly and to resolve problems that we have so far been unable to resolve. So yeah, the business case for diversity is clear and compelling. And I think many of the speakers today have spoken more to the moral case for diversity, which is also quite compelling. And so I think when you put those together, both the business case and the moral case, there's no reason why we should not urgently look to move the needle on this issue.
Thank you so much. And we may go just a minute or two over, so I apologize in advance for that. But I want to ask a question also to Shawn. Shawn Dove talked earlier about the impact that he is having in the community, changing the trajectory of lives for young Black men. Shawn, how are you measuring that? How will we measure change at all levels? What are some suggestions around the metrics that we need to be looking at to understand whether or not what we're doing is actually moving the needle, if you will?
So great question. And I think the first stop with measuring is beginning with Black people's assets and their aspirations. Too often we look at grant making and measurements, and it's from a deficit perspective. We look at crime rates, and we look at educational outcomes in a way that you got to lift up the problem. There's one of my colleagues, Travian Shorters at BME, does a phenomenal job about that. So across the board, let's take education, for example. One, how are we measuring suspension rates and the disparities of suspensions between Black children and their peers from other races? Kingmakers of Oakland and Oakland Unified School District is an example of a district-wide systemic approach where they created a decade ago the first ever district-wide Office of African American Male Achievement, right? So the list goes on, and right, being clear. I think what's really important is that data is really important, and also the storytelling together, right? One of the things I want to say in closing that is really important, and it speaks to the comments that Dr. Newkirk shared, is that we have to be very mindful in this moment that we don't take a racial equity and diversity icing and put it on a cake that has been baked with ingredients of racism, white supremacy, and disparities, right? And so when you want to measure as well, look at leadership. What's the representation on our boards? What's the representation in the C-suite levels? For example, with diversity and equity, is this pushed in HR? Or is it actually a C-suite position with the budget? So there's a wide range of, I think, measurements, building infrastructure of institutions and investing in Black leadership is also something that the Campaign for Black Male Achievement is highly interested in as an intermediary organization.
Yep, thank you so much, Shawn. Before we get out of time here, I definitely want to, I want our panelists to unmute themselves and come back on camera if you want to, because I want to give you one last shot to make one sentence. But before I do, I again want to thank Dr. Gittens, the entire UW-Madison staff that had hand of putting this on. Tracy Williams-Macklin, who's done an excellent job. You've heard her name referenced here several times. All my fellow colleagues on the Executive Diversity Council who had a hand in this. And I want to also give a shout out to a voice that we didn't hear today, Dr. Patrick Sims. Dr. Sims just did a fantastic job throughout his tenure at UW-Madison, being the Chief Diversity Officer, 17 years in service, and certainly created an environment for us to even have this conversation today. And we want to make sure that he knows how much we acknowledge and appreciate all the foundational work that he has put into place. And we understand it's our responsibility to build on that as he goes on to the North Carolina School of the Arts for brighter things in his career. We wish him well, but we also want to make sure that the foundation that was laid and the work that he's established here does not go in vain. And we know we're in great hands with Dr. Cheryl Gittens taking up the mantle and continuing that work. But I would ask our panelists, and this is going to be a quick fire round robin if you will, one sentence. It couldn't, maybe it doesn't even have to be a sentence. Maybe it's your one word in terms of, this is a call to action. What's the action item? What's the next step that needs to be taken to move the needle, to create better understanding, to end racism, if you will, with regard to all of these systems that we've talked about and discussed today, from the university system to the city, to what's going on in towns with the organizational institutions like the urban leagues and things. What's your sentence? What's your word in terms of moving people to action, something that the people listening today can write down and follow up with in terms of making sure that this was a moment in time that really counted? And so I'm going to go back to Dr. Newkirk and ask her for that response.
Well, Grady, it's hard to sum it up in a sentence, but I would say that all of the problems that we've discussed today can be changed with intention and will and leadership. And
Love it. Intention, will, and leadership. Thanks so much, Dr. Newkirk. Shawn Dove?
Yes, we all have to ask ourselves a question about, and answer it honestly. What are we doing about our purpose? What are we doing about our power? What are we doing about our privilege? What are we doing about our pride? And what are we doing about our pain on this journey to justice?
Well, that's a lot of P's, Dr. Dove. We appreciate that as a thought starter as well. What about you, Daryl Hines, DJ?
Excuse me. I think it's so important that we understand we are not to respond from a place of guilt, because guilt, once reconciled, can lose its energy. We have to respond from a place of passion for change. I think that would sum up my response.
Thank you, DJ. I don't know if Payton is still with us. Is Payton still with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, Payton.
I'm gonna just speak as like a recent alum directly to the university and just say to proactively support your students of color.
Thank you so much, Payton. Best of luck and support to you and your new role in Dallas. President Johnson. President Johnson still with us?
Thank you. I am still here. Thank you. The word that I would say is recognition. You have to know and recognize where these things start from. And coming from government, I would ask folks to take a look back at the founding documents of this country. Look at the Declaration of Independence and what it says. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And ask yourself the question about whether or not all people in America, whether you're Black, whether you're white, whether you're LGBT or any other, has those guarantees afforded to them. And I think the honest answer would be no. So we have to first recognize where we're starting from and build off there.
I love it. I love it. Don't keep your head buried in the sand. We need to acknowledge what's going on. Dr. Anthony?
Yeah, I would address this to the college and to the business community. Let's stop the brain drain. We need to keep our Black talent here. Make the investment in these Black young people. Give them hope and give them a reason to stay in Madison.
Love it. Dr. Wilcox already called me out on that one, so we'll definitely be following up with that. Claudia Marte.
Thank you. I wanted to just say Black Lives Matter, and please don't invalidate the historical trauma and experiences of Black people.
And both me and DJ would say amen to that. Dr. Steele. Dr. Steele?
Sorry about that. Earlier today, somebody mentioned the word urgency. And there's certain urgency, certainly urgency around all of the things that we talked about today. This is a great conversation, but it wasn't a casual one. So that double Dutch reference earlier, jumping in and doing something to bring about a greater sense of diversity, equity, and inclusion is important.
Yep, you're absolutely right. That was Shawn Dove that talked about risk, urgency, and momentum. And like I said, I love that double Dutch reference. We got to be willing to jump in. Dr. Wilcox.
I think we've got to engage everyone in this work, not just people of color, but everyone's got to be engaged in this work. But with respect to my Black friends and colleagues, we have to acknowledge, we have to celebrate, and we have to reward their success. And I don't think we have done that well enough.
I want to thank all of you for being willing to stand in the gap and make sure that we are building some bridges to help some folk that's going to come behind us, and even folk that are here today. I want to also again thank Nina Johnson, Senior Vice President at U.S. Bank, and U.S. Bank's sponsorship of this forum. And again, Dr. Cheryl Gittens and all of our friends at UW-Madison. We can't let this be a situation where we're just doing T's and P's, thoughts and prayers. We have to turn this into action. And so we look forward to talking about how we are converting this into action, and then talking about the progress that we're making from here. Again, my name is Grady Crosby. It has been my pleasure to be with you today. I hope all of you have an outstanding day and go out and make it a great day. But if you can't do that, make sure you don't mess up anybody else's day. Have a great one.